care about Gaza. I think that's the fundamental fact. During Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there were a couple of demonstrations in support of Gaza. The Israeli repression, there was Israeli repression, but it wasn't the main factor. Whenever anyone wants to blame the repression as the main factor, it's an excuse. The Palestinians in the West Bank, they resisted the Israeli army during the first Intifada. If they wanted to, they could have resisted or expressed support for Gaza. During Operation Protective Edge, there was nothing in the West Bank. And then the same thing during the Great March of Return. So it's not altogether surprising that the so-called solidarity movement didn't react. Plus, as you know, I'm of the opinion that most of this BDS solidarity movement is a fiction created by Israel and its supporters. BDS never had any impact on Israel, none at all. Israel inflated it, exactly what it did with the Hamas so-called rockets. There were no rockets. More people die on the 4th of July here from fireworks, here meaning the United States, than died in Gaza. Israel destroyed 18,000 homes in Gaza. The Hamas rockets, they destroyed one house. Probably it hit the boiler by accident. That's probably what happened. But Israel inflated the Hamas rockets as an excuse, a pretext for destroying Gaza. What country would allow rockets to be fired at it? Show me one country in the world. What would the United States do if Mexico or Canada were firing rockets at it? All that nonsense. And it was the same thing with BDS. BDS, Israel, because they're reasonably smart, not geniuses, but they're reasonably smart. They decide we can use this BDS, claim that claim that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is trying to destroy Israel, to delegitimize the state of Israel, as they called it. And then they claimed all criticism of Israel from any quarter across the spectrum, all of it was BDS. That lurking behind every criticism of Israel was BDS, and BDS wants to destroy Israel. Therefore, all criticism of Israel is BDS, and all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic because it wants to destroy the state of Israel. So they conflated everything, and they used BDS. You know what the expression is with jiu-jitsu, where you use your opponent's strength against him. So it was a kind of jiu-jitsu strategy, where they used BDS, inflated it beyond imagination, like the Hamas rockets, in order to delegitimize the delegitimizers, in order to delegitimize the BDS, which they claimed was delegitimizing Israel. So they delegitimized the delegitimizers, and I have to say, that was very successful also. BDS was going around saying, look how important we are. Israel has all of these organizations and investing all this money in trying to stop us. It must mean we're very effective. And so they're boasting about their successes as the Israeli juggernaut is destroying all possible resistance in the West to its occupation by claiming it's all BDS and anti-Semitic. And they managed to pass a lot of legislation. The most recent battle is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. And as the other day, there was a letter in The Guardian by several, the British Guardian. There was a letter in the British Guardian by several lawyers, barristers, as you call them. And they point out in paragraph 5 of their letter, they point out that this whole IHRA definition is about Israel. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's about Israel. And they used the BDS as a juggernaut. They used it, as I said, in jiu-jitsu fashion. They legitimized the delegitimizers. Now, let me be clear. Israel was on a roll, and it would have gone after the solidarity movement, come what may. But BDS handed it to them in a silver platter because it wouldn't take a stand in Israel. It wouldn't take a position in Israel. So it was easy to construe that as though they want to destroy Israel. They made it easy for the other side. I'm not saying the other side wouldn't have gone on the offensive. They were on a roll. As you saw in the UK, after they destroyed Corbyn, then they decide, hey, we're going to destroy any opposition to Israel, not only in the Labour Party, but in any unis in the UK. They were on a roll. You couldn't stop these. You can't stop these people. You cannot stop them. At least not yet. So they finally got Oxford to cave in, then Cambridge to cave in. Cambridge was just a few days ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. So it would have been tough. However, correct the opposition was, but the BDS made it easy. It handed it on a silver platter by refusing to take a position on Israel.
So if I could just ask like a quick follow-up to your response, I think I have like a bit of personal experience with what you described in terms of Israel using BDS to delegitimize all opposition to the occupation. When I was doing my undergrad at the University of Nottingham, some people in the Israeli society would basically argue when I would advocate for boycotting settlement goods, so like products which are exclusively produced in illegal settlements in the West Bank, they would say, oh, that's BDS, and like BDS is against the existence of Israel. And
that's absolutely correct. That's what they did. They conflated any opposition to Israeli policy with BDS. And then they said BDS wants to destroy Israel. Then they said that's anti-Semitic. And they managed to delegitimize all opposition to Israel. That's the legacy of BDS. And their leadership are imbeciles. I'm not afraid to say that. You see, I went through, I'm not a young man anymore, as is perfectly obvious to you guys. I went through those phases where we have to defer to the oppressed and listen to the voice of the oppressed. That's all manipulation. It's all psychological manipulation by people who have oversized egos. And I'm not afraid of that anymore. I paid a price. I was canceled twice. I was canceled the first 20 years of my life by mainstream culture, and I was canceled the second 20 years of my life by left-wing culture, the BDS. There was a time when I would speak maybe 40 places a year I was always on the road. It was exhausting. And I hate to fly. I have a flying illness. But I did it for the cause. After BDS decided I was the enemy, I went from 40 speaking engagements a year to 0. They controlled all of the, what were called SJPs, Students for Justice in Palestine. But they're imbeciles. I'm not afraid to say that. Power hungry. And that's their only legacy. Their legacy is they destroyed they didn't destroy the Palestinian cause. I have to be careful about my words, and I am careful about my words. The cause was destroyed in Palestine. It was destroyed in Palestine. It was beginning from Oslo. It was downhill. Professor Said saw that. That's basically why he opted out of the Palestine movement, and he became involved in cultural things. The West Eastern Diwan Orchestra. He was smart enough, shrewd enough to see it's over. But the BDS, it was all manipulation. The leader of the BDS, Omar Barghouti, he went to school in New York. I knew him quite well. He went to Columbia University, he studied electrical engineering, and he knew white liberals. He knew especially white Jewish liberals, because Columbia is predominantly, of the Ivy League universities, it's the one that's predominantly Jewish because it's in New York City. And he knew how to manipulate them. You know, we're the voice of the oppressed. You have to listen to the voice of the oppressed. And what about Palestinian voices? All of this crap to intimidate, to guilt trip, as we used to call it in the 60s, to guilt trip Westerners into doing whatever they said. And if you didn't do it, it's because you're a Western colonialist, Zionist, liberal, you know, all this stupid, idiotic, these epithets they hurled at you. I mean, the other day, not the other day, about more than a half year, no, it's already more than a year ago. I was very strangely, I was invited to speak at Oberlin College, which is a good school in the United States. I was invited to speak at Oberlin by a Palestinian support group. And by the end of the evening, as I was leaving, I wasn't aware of it. They posted on their website a denunciation of me as being a Western Zionist, imperialist, colonialist, anti-trans, anti-gay, sexist. I mean, I was speaking about Gaza. Yeah, I was speaking about people they've lost their marbles, their minds. And the Palestine Solidarity Movement, it degenerated. Its only legacy is it made easier, it facilitated the destruction of the Palestine movement in the United States. That's Omar Barghouti's only legacy, but he'll never see it. If you look at the press releases of BDS, which he writes, it still talks about their victories. Their victories. You know, there was a famous moment in the 1982 Lebanon War when the Palestinians were defeated. And Arafat is leaving Lebanon. He was en route to Tunis at that point. And he has a big smile on his face, and he's holding up the V for victory. And one of his lieutenants, and the guy named Shafiq al-Hut, who was the head of the refugee organizations, he represented the Palestinian Liberation Organization among the refugees in Lebanon. He was relatively speaking a decent guy. And he said at the time, one more victory like this